Rika from My Creative Quilts, and today I've got a project to show you. It's a tutorial, and hopefully I'm going to walk you through it so that you can learn how to do it yourself. It's a very easy way to use a panel that you like but you don't know what to do with it, or even if you have a piece of focus fabric. A lot of us have really pretty fabrics that are maybe 25 by 40 inches or something like that. We don't really know what to do with them, and but we don't want to get rid of them because they're so nice, we like them. So this project will give you an idea of what you can do, and it's a technique, it's not a pattern. And that's really important for me to emphasize, because a technique means I can't give you exact measurements, and it's really totally dependent on how you see the fabric and how you see the outcome. So bear with me as I go through the process, and hopefully I don't get too confusing for you and that you will like the outcome. So this is the project I'm going to show you. So this is one of the quilts that I just made using this technique. As you can see, I used a winter scene panel, and I used a navy blue for the background. And what makes it particularly fun is that the panel itself wasn't very wide, and I wasn't sure what to do with it other than maybe just put a border around it or something. But this technique expanded it, and it let me make a lap size quilt. So this is the center of the panel, and then you move outward. And I quilted it just random swirls. There's a really nice backing there. It's a minky or a cuddle. So that is the project that we're going to work on. Not this particular panel, but that's going to show you what it will look like. Back in the sewing room, and I'm going to show you some fabrics and how you can decide what you're going to use for this project and what might work and what might not work. So really, actually anything works. And I might be looking down at my cheat sheet sometimes. I want to make sure I don't forget to tell you something important. So this particular piece of fabric I have is 21 inches wide by 40. Now generally for this technique, I tell you, or I suggest that you don't use anything smaller than 26 inches, but something that's only 23 inches would work too. If you want to just do like a wall hanging, or if you just want to have something in the center of a big quilt, it's entirely up to you. So this is a possibility. It's really nice because you could choose any color for the background and the sashing color. So that definitely would work. This panel is 21 inches by 42. So again, it's a little narrow, but another thing you can think about is maybe doing two if you want to do a wider quilt. So that would work too. If you want to use this technique for a bed-size quilt or a larger wall hanging, you could even go as large as 44 by 44, which is this Dream Big panel. That would work too. The only thing I would suggest, if you're making a bed-size quilt with this pattern, I would make the sashing, the background strips, a little bit wider than you would for a smaller quilt. Now those are panels, but you can also use focus fabrics. For example, I like this fall foliage type fabric. I have it on the backing of one of my quilts actually. So that would actually look really nice, maybe, I think, with this as a sashing. So instead of having the sashing darker than the panel will be darker than the sashing. Another option is to do like maybe a floral. Cut a piece of that, and I think this would look nice as a sashing. Or maybe the green or something totally different. It's up to you. Or you could just do something really simple with a piece of fabric like this. And again, this gives you a lot of options. You could choose a red background, you could choose anything, and that could be really fun too. So what I'm doing for this project is I found this pretty bird fabric in my stash, and I'm trying to remember how wide it is. Let me just do a quick measure. It is 40 inches wide. So I'm probably going to cut that so it's not quite as wide, but this is what I'm going to do. And I have some more of that navy blue fabric that I showed you on the quilt just now, and I'm going to use that for the sashing. So that's what we're going to do. And now on to the project. Okay, so here we go. Now, to do this project, you have to have paper and pencil, pen and paper, to keep track of your numbers, because if you're anything like me, you're going to forget the minute you walk away from your table. So that's just a word of advice. People who are curious about my work table, this is actually the back of my long arm where you put the pantograph if you want to use it. And I like to use it when I'm showing things because it gives me more space. My cutting table is good, but I prefer to use this for this purpose. So I have my fabric, and I have to decide how big do I want the quilt to be. I like to make my lap quilts about 42, 43 inches wide, because then I can use just a regular piece of fabric for the backing, but it really depends on what you want to do. So I'm aiming for about 42, 43 inches. So I'm going to write this down. I want it to be 42 inches wide when it's done. Now again, this is not a pattern, it's a technique, which means I'm not going to get it at 42. It's going to be shorter, it's going to be not quite as wide, or it'll be wider, but that's okay because I can either cut or I can add borders to make it the width that I really want it. And I think I want it about 50 inches long. Okay, so then you take your fabric or your panel to your ironing board and press the center so you know where it is. You can mark it, pressing I find makes it easier. Now you're going to need some sort of measuring thing. Some people like to use measuring tapes, which work. Let me just get my measuring tape. Hang on a second. Here we go. You can use your measuring tape. You can use a wider ruler. Some people use a piece of paper. They take either like adding machine paper, or what I did is I just tape pieces together. And this is handy because let's say you want to do a piece that has, this is for another project, not this one, but I'm going to show you why this is a good idea. So let's see, till it's about this wide, I'll rip that off. And let's say I wanted to have 8 individual lines at exactly the right same space. You fold your piece of paper in half. Then you fold it in half again. I'm not being exact here, sorry. And then you fold it in half again and you press it really well. Then when you open it, you have your exact measurements and you can mark them. So using paper is really handy. And then there's also special devices that you can buy. I don't remember which quilt shop I got this from, but this is really handy. The only thing is it only works if you want each strip to be exactly right, exactly the same size. And that's not the case for me for this particular project. So this won't work for me. I'll put that aside. So now I've got my decisions to make about how wide I want my strips to be. Now, generally for the center, I tend to make it 3 inches wide. Sewn together with your seam allowance, it becomes 2.5, right? So always remember that we need to keep in mind the seam allowances. Now, if this was a panel with a lot of details, maybe some flowers or something like that, and there's something that I wanted to make sure was in the strip, I have to be careful that's not where I cut it. So let's say this starfish was a really central part of the pattern, and I wanted to make sure that it was in the strip. I can't cut here then because you're not going to see it. I would have to make sure I cut on each side of it. So I would have to keep that in mind. Okay, so those are the decisions you have to make. How wide do you want your strips to be? And is there anything in the fabric that you really want to highlight? Okay, so for this one, I marked my center. I want my middle strip to be 3 inches. Now there's no rule as to how wide each strip is. Some people make all their strips exactly the same size. Some people make the center one bigger and then all the other ones the same size. Some alternate. The only rule, if you want to call it a rule, is that they have to match. What I mean by matching is this is the center strip. So these 2 strips are the same size. These 2 strips are the same size. And these 2 strips are the same size. But it's your quilt. If you decide you wanted to have it all wonky and have this one 3 inches and this one 1 inch and this one 2 inches, it's up to you. It's a technique. You do whatever you want. But that's for people like me who tend to see things, they need to be symmetrical. It drives them a bit crazy if it's not symmetrical. This is what you do. Okay? Okay, so I had decided that I want to have my center strip to be 3 inches. So I'm going to mark at 1.5 inches because it's folded. Okay, now remember, 3 inches wide that I'm cutting, I will get 2.5 inches when it's sewn together because we have a 1/4 inch off of each side. Then I have to decide how many strips I want to do and how wide I want them to be. This is already a good width, so I don't know if I'm going to use the whole thing. So I'm just eyeballing it and thinking, okay, the middle one is going to be 2.5 inches finished. So I think I want the 2 side ones to be a little bit wider. I'm going to be a little bit different here. So I'm going to make them 3.5 inches, or 1, 2, 3. I'm going to make them 4 inches, the strip that I cut. So that's sewn together, it'll be 3.5. And then I think I want the next 2 strips on each side to be 3 inches wide finished. So I'm going to cut them at 3.5. then I'm going to continue the 3.5. That's what I decided I want the rest of the strips to be. So that's 1, 2, 3.5. 1, 2, 3.5. Now, one of the fun things about this project is you don't have to be exact. As long as Cindy Needham, who's a really great quilter and quilting teacher, says ish a lot. It's ish. So it can be 3.5 inches ish, 3 inches ish. As long as it's consistent, it doesn't matter if you're off a little bit. So that's what's really great about this technique. So now I've got my marks. I've got my center, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this one is going to be 9, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, this one's going to be 9 strips wide. So I'm probably not going to be using the end. So now it's time to cut. Now for cutting, again, you don't have to have the exact widths as long as it's consistent on each side, which is why I double it and cut it this way. The important thing is to make sure that you're straight, okay? Because that's going to cause a problem if you're not straight. So I'm just turning this around so it makes it easier for me to cut. And my marks are here. So my first cut is going to be here. Okay, get my ruler. Oh, I need to move it up a bit more. Make sure I'm on my 1.5 mark there. Make sure I'm on my 1.5 mark all the way down. Now this I don't like, it's not quite long enough for the ruler, so I'm gonna have to move it. And that's how I sometimes make a little bit of slip with my cutting, so I have to be careful. Okay, so I'm double checking 1.5. So I'm gonna get 3 inches. That's what I said I wanted, right? All right, let's go. Make sure it's lined up. All right, so there we go. We have our middle strip. Okay, I'm just gonna have to press that flat before I put it on the design wall. Okay, now the next most important thing when you're doing this is to remember to mark each strip. The reason for that is if you don't, you're gonna end up doing what I did, which was sewing strips on upside down or to the wrong side. So always mark your strips. So this one, I've already written at my papers. I always stick the papers to the bottom strip so I know automatically it's a strip, because sometimes it's not obvious which is the top or the bottom, especially when you're looking at a narrow 2-inch strip. So this is my center. I'm just going to pin this on and I'm going to set this aside. Okay, now we're going to cut the next one, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to go along and cut all the strips until they're all cut out. Now that all the cuts have been made, I just open them up the strips so that I can make sure I mark them properly. If they're folded, it gets a little bit confusing as to what's on the right side and what's on the left side. So I just open it up. So I have my 2 strips on each pile, like this. Okay. So this was the center. So this side is the left side of the center panel. So I take my L1 marker and I pin my L1 to the bottom, which means the other side is R1. It's the first one that will go on the right side of the quilt. So I mark that. Then I look for L2, which I've already marked here somewhere. Hang on a second, that was R3. Here we go, L2. So put L2 at the bottom. R2. It's really not worth it to skip this step. I wasted so much time on one of these because I didn't bother labeling it, and it was very frustrating. So we have L3 here. I didn't make L4 and R4, but that's okay. So I'll know that the 2 that aren't marked, actually, no, you know what? I need to mark them because of the right and the left. I don't have a choice. So I will just quickly just rip up a piece of paper here and write L4 and R4. Because with my luck, I'll end up putting them upside down. I totally lost count of the number of times I had to rip out the seams on that blue one that I showed you. Okay, they're all marked. Now I'm going to go put them on my design board or your design wall or design floor, design bed, whatever you use to mark your quilts. So here we have the strips on the design wall, and you can see I have them from the center out. there you see the markers, center L1, L2, L3, and onwards. I'm missing one strip here because I had taken it off to double check something. So let me just put it back so it doesn't look too confusing. Someone's going to look at it and say, wait, there's not enough strips on there. This one there. There we go. Okay, so I've taken my center strip and my R1 and my L1. Like I said, always work on the two at the same time and fold it in half so that you know you're being symmetrical if that's what you want to do. So I'm going to take the center one out because I have cut in the past and cut into a piece of fabric just sitting there. So that wasn't good. So there we go. So now I'm going to turn this over because, no, I'm just going to leave it like this. Now, there are some people who say you should never cut using the measurements on a cutting board. You should only use a ruler. I don't agree with that. Their reasoning is that the cutting board might not be exactly accurate, the inch might be off a little bit, but the same can happen with a ruler. So my rule of thumb is you use the same measurements for the entire project. So if you're going to be using the cutting board for measurements, only use the cutting board for measuring. If you're going to use a ruler for measurements, only use the ruler. That helps mitigate any issues with slight variations in measurement. So it's entirely up to you. But anyway, so these are lined up now. I have my R1 and my L1. I'm going to have to take the labels off because I don't want to cut or hit the pins by accident. I just have to make sure I put them in the right place. So the one at the top will be R1, the one at the bottom is L1. So I said I want to have 3 inches taken off of the top. So I've trimmed the edge straight already, and I'm going to cut 3 inches. So I'm going to use the cutting board as my measurement. 1, 2, 3. That brings me here. And I will double check. 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inches. And I'll make my cut. There we go. Now, before I forget, I'm just going to put the labels right back on again because I will forget. And see how that's going to look? This comes out a little bit further. The center comes out a little bit further. There we go. So I'm going to go put these two back on the design wall, and I will write down that I cut 3 inches off, just so I keep track, because sometimes I can get distracted. The phone might ring. I might think of something else I need to do. I might see something shiny. So I took 3 inches off of L1 and R1. So I mark that down. So now I've lined up L2 and R2. Those are the ones that'll go on the outside of the two that we just cut. Now the beauty of this technique is, like I said, you don't have to be accurate. So I had said I want this one to be 2.5 inches lower than the strip that will be right next to it. So I already cut 3 inches off. So if I want to add another 2.5 inches, I need to cut 5.5 inches off of this. Now, it doesn't matter if you do 5 1/4 or if you do 4.75. It doesn't matter because you're going to be consistent on the top and the bottom and on both sides. So that's what I meant about the beauty of it not having to be absolutely precise. So I'm just going to trim this a touch. There's a little bit of rough edge on the end. There we go. So 5 inches, I have to bring that down to the line actually. The line, when all the strips are cut, there's going to be a little bit of an unevenness, but we're just going to trim the top and the bottom and it will work out. Don't worry about that. So I want 5.5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5. And you can see this is what I cut off from the first set of strips. So it's an extra 2.5 inches off of that. There we go. And I'll just put the labels back on. Now we are at R3 and L3. So far I've cut off 3 inches, then I cut off another 2.5 inches, and I said I wanted to cut another 2.5 inches. So 5.5 plus 2.5 is 8 inches. Okay, so just to double check, I do this sometimes. This was my original cut from the first row. This was my second cut for the second row. And now I'm going to do 8 inches. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. See, I'm being consistent. I'm using the cutting board for all the measurements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And finally, we have R4 and L4, the outside strips. So I want to do another 2.5 inches. So far I've cut up to 8 inches off. So another 2.5 will bring us to 10.5. And just to double check, here are the strips that I did before. That's my 8-inch strip, I think. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yeah. So I want to do another, so I want to do 10.5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.5. There we go. So I will cut it right there. There we go. The focus fabric or the panel strips have now been cut out. Check it out. This is what it looks like now on the design board. See? The center strip goes all the way up and down like that. So now we have to figure out how to make the side strips all match the center, and that's really easy. Okay, now we're going to add the background fabric. This is where you need to do a little bit of note taking again. You might not need what you write down, but it's helpful to have it in case you forget. So the center, I've taken the label off, so I know that the one strip that is not labeled is the center. The center is 1, 2, 3 inches longer than here. Okay, so I want to have 3 inches here. Now don't forget, I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch on the sashing fabric, and I'm going to lose 1/4 of an inch on this fabric. So I have to cut 3.5 inches, if that makes sense. It's going to end up being a little bit more than 3 inches on the end, but that's okay. We're going to trim it off. So just make sure that you cut yourself enough. So I'm going to cut 3.5 inches wide. Better to cut too wide and cut it down than to not have enough. Okay, so I'm going to need 4 pieces, one for the top, one for the bottom on each side. So I need 4 pieces of 3.5 inches, or long, not wide, sorry, long. Now it needs to be the same width as these strips. So these strips, these 2 strips are 4 inches wide. So I'm going to cut 4 pieces of the dark blue that are 3.5 inches this way and 4 inches this way. And then I'm going to sew them on each end. I always backstitch a little bit, even with the strips, just because I find it too easy to pull the stitching apart when you're pinning things together. Just a couple of stitches. Then you set your seam and you press it to the dark side. Or you can press it open if you want. I don't tend to press my seams open. I like them over to the side, but it really just depends on what you're doing. And we're back to the cutting table. You see, I added the blue edges, and now they are the same length as the center strip. It's not exactly the same, but that's okay. We're going to trim it at the end. Okay, now I said I wanted 3 inches, and by sewing on 3.5 inches, I gave myself that. So the measurement is 3 1/4. 1/4 of the inch is going to be in the seam allowance here. So that looks good. I'm happy with that. Now, the next step is going to be L2 and R2. So I'm going to take the center out of the mix now. We don't need that there anymore. And actually, we don't need that one there anymore. We just need to have one like that. And this, at the same time, you can look at it and see if you made the right decision. If you might maybe want to make a little bit more of the background color here. Unfortunately, you can't add less unless you make the strip longer, cut another strip or add to it. But you can, maybe you can say, oh, you know what? I think I really want it to be longer. So this is when you can change your mind if you want. So that's L2 and that's R2. Okay, now we need 5.5 inches to get to the end here. So I'm going to cut 6 inches to be on the safe side. It'll give me a little bit more probably, but that's okay. I'd rather have a little bit more than a little bit less. So I need to have 4 pieces that are going to be 6 inches long. And how wide are my strips? My strips are 3.5. So I need to cut 4 blue rectangles, 6 inches by 3.5, and sew them to the edge. So here we have the center, L1, L2, and now I've got L3 and R3, and we repeat the same thing. Let's move this out of the way. We don't need that one there. We just need one of them, so I'm going to line that one up. So now we are at L3. And L3 ends at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.5 inches from the end. So I'm going to cut 8-inch long pieces because of the seam allowance. So I need 4 pieces that are 8 inches long and 3.5 inches wide. So I'm going to write this down. 4 pieces of 8 inches long by 3.5. So here we are finished with L3 and R3, and we have one more set of strips to go. Now this is a good time to point out a mistake that I made, which you might make at some point, but it's not the end of the world. It's definitely fixable. When I calculated that this was to be 8 inches, I was off. If you can see, I'm off by 1/2 inch. But that's okay. I'm going to trim it so it's all down 1/2 inch. It will all work out in the end. But that goes to show that even when you're being careful, you can still make a mistake. That's okay. We'll manage. So now I have to do my last one. This time I'll make sure I get it right. So we are here. We are now, since this is the shortest strip of the 3, this is our new measuring guideline. So this strip is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 inches shorter. So I'm going to cut 10.5 inches of the dark blue to put on the last strip. And here we have it. Here's L4. You can see it went down gradually. So before we go on to the next step, we need to make sure all our strips are the same length. And as I pointed out, one got cut a bit shorter. So that will be our guideline. So this one, L3, is the shortest one. So I'm going to move the other ones. And I'm going to measure the length of L3. So it looks like L3 is 24.5 inches. So I'm going to cut these strips as well as the ones from the right side all to 24.5 inches. Now don't forget, these are folded in half. So it's not 24.5 inches, it's 24.5 inches times 2. But to make it easier for cutting and for symmetry and making sure everything's equal, it's folded in half. And check it out. Look how it's taking shape. Look at that. This is definitely an afternoon project. Once you know how to do it, it can be a little bit disconcerting the first time you're doing it. But once you've done it once, I can almost guarantee you can do it in a couple of hours in an afternoon or morning. So now, if I've not yet made the decision, now is the time you have to decide how wide you want your sashings to be. For this size quilt, for most of these quilts, I do 1 inch, which means I have to cut a 1.5 inch. If you have a narrower panel, narrower piece of fabric, and you want to expand it, you can make the sashings wider. Just don't make them too wide. You don't want them to overwhelm your panel or your focus fabric. So I'm off to cut my sashings at 1.5 inches, and then I'm going to sew them all together. Some people wonder if they should cut their sashings width of fabric or length of fabric. It depends on what you want, and if you're careful about the bias or whatever. When I'm making lap quilts, sometimes I can get away with doing the width, not very often. Now I know the strips are 49 inches long. So to be on the safe side, I'm just going to say 50. So I'm going to cut a length of fabric of 50 inches. And those are going to be my strips so that I don't have to join anything together because the width is not long enough. And here I'm cutting the last strip. Now, one of the disadvantages to a technique as opposed to a pattern is we can't tell you how much fabric you need. And so please don't ask. Please don't leave comments and ask how much fabric you need for this thing. It really depends on how big you want your quilt to be. It depends on how much background fabric you're going to use, how big you want your borders to be, and your binding. So you need a good couple of yards or meters, but you have to really ballpark it. I can't tell you because I don't know what you have in mind. So now that I've cut my strips, I'm going to sew them to the strips that are on the wall, and then I'm going to sew them all together and you will see what the outcome is. You can see it's starting to take shape. If you look at the 2 strips on the left-hand side, you'll see that the sashing has been put in and they've been sewn together. So I'm just going to finish sewing the rest of the top and then we'll talk about the borders. I am always so excited when something turns out the way I thought it would. It doesn't always happen that way. So I'm delighted, I'm surprised, I'm happy, the whole bit. I mean, look, it just fell into place. Big part of the success was the labeling of the strips. I didn't put anything upside down. I didn't put something on the right, on the left. For this particular fabric, it wouldn't have really mattered. But if you have a pattern with a distinct picture, a panel with a distinct picture, it's gonna look really funny if you do that. So I'm just thrilled with it. So it's about 34 inches wide, 34, 35 inches wide, give or take. And I want the quilt to be about 45 inches wide. So now come the border decisions. So we have a little border up here because we don't want this to just end like that. We need it to be a little bit consistent. So I'm thinking probably an inch or 2, probably about 2 inches on each end on the bottom, 5 inches on each side on the sides. And that will complete the quilt. You'll see that my edge isn't even. That's fine. I'm going to trim it so that it's even on the top and on the bottom. And then once the border is on, it's going to be finished. That's how quick this pattern is, or technique. It's very fast and it's very effective. People are going to think you spent a lot of time working on it. So let me put the borders on and then I will show you the finished product. Check it out, it's finished. Look, I put the border, I put 5 inches on the sides and I decided to put 3 inches on the top. That was so that I knew I could have room to trim if I wanted. But there it is, we have our 9 focus fabric strips. We have our 8 background fabric sashings, and then we have our background. And the quilt is done. Now, I want to point out this is not my idea. It's not my technique. It's been around for a long time. I've seen other quilts done this way, and I just sat down and figured out how I could do it best. But there might be a different way other people do it. So it's entirely up to you whether you follow these instructions or you try and find some other ones. But this is a really great way to show off some favorite fabric or some panels. So I hope you liked this video on how to make a quilt out of a favorite panel or just a beautiful fabric that you really like. And if you visit mycreativequilts.com, you'll find lots of other tips and tricks on different quilting projects. You'll find photos and discussions on projects that I've done. And there'll also be more videos along the way. So thank you for joining me. Bye.